If you're selling here to the big five in Europe, like, if it's UK, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, I mean, if you're serious about the market, I think you got to figure out to have some kind of localized content.
Welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast, where experts discuss international content management, product localization, and global expansion. I'm Katerina from Undertow. We create and manage localization programs for B2B SaaS companies so they can grow globally. Today, our founder, Nicola Calabrese, will be talking with Daniel Nackovski and Thomas Sjöberg from SaaSiest. They will share their insights on international expansion, diving into the key challenges that European SaaS companies face when scaling beyond their home markets. From navigating cultural and linguistic differences to understanding regional buying behaviors and building local credibility, we will explore what it takes to succeed. So, let's dive in.
Hello, Daniel and Thomas, and welcome to the Multilingual Content Podcast. How are you today?
Very good, thank you. How are you, Nicola?
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for being here. It's so great to have you here on the podcast. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the international expansion experience that you picked up from learnings you heard from other founders and the ones from your own experience as well. But before we jump right into the topic, would you mind introduce yourself a little bit and share what's your role at SaaSiest, what's the community?
Absolutely. We're happy to do so. And I want to start off with a flex, actually, if you don't mind, now that I have the spotlight all on me. I know quite a bit about your world. Like in a previous life, 15 years ago or something like that, I was part of a company called Across Systems. Maybe you've heard of them. They did translation management solutions. So I know quite a bit about TMS platforms. And at that time, the big player was STL. Probably a lot of things have changed since then. But I've seen my share of localization and machine learning in the language elements when it was early phase. I think you're in a very exciting spot. Like there's something magical with language and how it bridges people or how it could divide people. So you're probably a fun place to be in.
And continuing down the history lane before we talk about what we do at SaaSiest, both of us, we have been 15 to 20 years in the SaaS space. We met at InRiver, a product information management solution, where also languages played a big part when you enrich your product information in order to go out in many markets with your product. So both integrations with different language providers, translation agencies, and so on was a big part of it. So
exactly. Try selling screws and bolts in Germany, an English manual or English product description. I don't think anybody has ever had success with that.
Yeah, but continuing with SaaSiest. SaaSiest is a B2B SaaS community and was born in the Nordics, but our mission is to sort of bring the European SaaS community together, because what we realized a couple of years ago is that the US playbook that we are fed with a lot, it doesn't really apply to many of the SaaS companies here in Europe. And one thing is the international situation. We need to think international from the get-go. It's not enough to be number one in Sweden or number one in Belgium and so on. So we have that with us very early. And I think that's something that we see a lot in the European SaaS community. And what we do events, soon it's coming up our flagship event in Malmö, where we gather 1,200 people for 2 to 3 days. We do networks. We have Europe's largest CEO network for B2B SaaS, and we also have an extensive executive network. So we do 230 online network meetings a year. So a very, very active community within SaaSiest.
And in simple terms, our mission is a little bit what we're going to try to do here today. Is like we want to bring people together to share battle stories with each other, to share real success stories, real failures, real pain points. People learn best from the people that are in the trenches, and we try to be the forum where they can meet.
Yeah, democratized knowledge is something that we usually get back to, and do it in a fun way. I mean, we are the SaaSiest community, right? So you need to do it in a fun way.
Oh yeah, last year I was in Amsterdam and this year I will be in Malmö. So I know what you're talking about when you're making it fun. Yeah.
Great. Welcome again.
And the first thing, as you said rightly, Thomas, the companies, especially in Europe, they need to think like international from the get-go, but like going in all markets and once it's not really possible. So do you have any like advice or from your conversation with other founders and your own experience, like What do you think are the criteria to identify which international markets to start from and expand into for SaaS companies?
Yeah, great question. And we get this question quite a bit in our community. And the boring answer is, it depends. It depends. There's a standard path that many take, which is, where are we linguistically and culturally most similar? So if you take, for many of the Nordic companies, if they start in one of the Nordic companies, they usually expand into the other Nordic companies rather quickly, because there is culturally, we're very similar, linguistically, we're very similar, but also the legal system is similar. And what people often underestimate, the way you do business in these 5 countries is more or less identical. So the barrier there is very low. Again, if you look at the Nordic companies, usually their path is they try to pick the next entry points based on who understands English the best. And that's usually they go to Benelux and they go to UK. So there's a linguistic play there. But for some companies, that model doesn't apply. It's not enough that we are culturally similar or that I can speak to you in English and it makes it easy for me. Depending on what you're selling, it might be that if you have an enterprise solution and you're looking for like the Fortune 1000 of Europe, well, you might not go to Finland first. There's not so many. So that then drives which region you approach. And suddenly you're starting to look at, maybe it's Germany you're approaching, maybe it's France you're approaching. So it depends a little bit of what your product is and what your customers are. And that puts a very different challenge on you. And then we see different levels of adaptation here. If you're selling enterprise solution, if you're suddenly approaching France and Germany, that puts so much more pressure for you to localize. Not just, I would say everybody has now and should have UI flexible in all kinds of languages and so on, but it's so much more than that. You need to be able to speak to these people in their own language. You need to be able to tell these people and promise them that if we do business, it's going to continue to be like this. SLAs are localized. Aftermarket support and customer success is localized. They're starting to expect these things from you. I guess the standard answer is it depends on what you're selling and to whom you're selling it to.
Yeah, and going back to what you're selling, so I think there are certain products that might be more process related, or there is a lot of legislation and so on to take into account. And then Germany might be a great market for you because they are very strict regarding that. And they want these very clear systems that can help you to implement that. So I think we have seen some companies that have great results in Germany, even if Germany in general, if you come from the outside, is a tough market to get into.
And I've seen as well the different level of, let's say, maturity they have within the market where you're trying to enter, because your product might not even be like product that people and companies use in that country. So that as well to take into account. If you'll see the competition is an Excel spreadsheet is one thing. If your competition is like a consolidated company or they've been there for a time, that as well, I guess it's a different element to take into account.
And it's a very important point because I think the experienced people, the companies that have done this before, the people that have been on this journey, they look at this holistically. And one thing we often see that maybe companies that are doing this for the first time, their geo expansion, or people that are doing it for the first time, they're missing a little bit to check some points that when we say it, I think people feel like, oh yeah, that's a no-brainer. But it's the willingness to pay or the capability to pay. Just because somebody, I'm speaking hypothetically here now, loves your product in country A and is willing to pay 5,000 euros for it, it might be so that they will also love it in country B. But maybe in country B, they're not willing to pay 5,000 euros. Maybe you can only make 1,000 euros or 2,000 euros a month for this product. So that might disqualify a market. So you got to understand like what are the reference points when it comes to willingness to pay. Can people pay for your product in these markets? If it's a no, then it doesn't matter that you have a culture match. You can figure out the linguistics and so on. You don't have product market fit.
And when it comes to the UK, I think what's great is that English speaking, of course, and for many, it's a sort of a stepping stone or a test ground if they can go to the US next, right? But the thing is that it's a tough market because it's also where all the US companies enters Europe. So everyone comes there and it's a big battleground. So we see many companies that has a hard time making success in the UK, even if it's a big market and even if they don't need to translate all of their material. So, yeah.
Yeah, because I was wondering, and this is connected to something else I want to ask you, is about the different, let's say, adaptation of the product and your messaging to adapt it to the culture where you're going. It's because it might be easy, as you said, like entering the UK, there's not much adaptation. You have the same language, but maybe it is worth to adapt your product and your messaging to enter a completely different market where there's not much competition, it's not oversaturated. And on that, I was wondering, do you have any recommendation or like ideas or what you heard from stories from other founders as well about like adapting the product and the messaging to the cultural differences?
Yeah, and also a great question. And I'm going to say this is a double-edged sword a little bit here, because you want to be as local as you possibly can without ending up in having two different companies, two different messages. Or if you're in 5 markets, then 5 different messages, 5 different products, because that complicates things. So you need to find a way where you have a strong core and there's flavors on top of this core that help you adapt. Because many mistakes that people do, especially when they go to the US, what we've experienced, and Thomas and I, we've been in this boat ourselves. We've had the pleasure to be part of 2 US expansions. It's easy that you go into a market, you hire local superstars, and they say like, oh, that shit that works in Europe doesn't work over here. We need to completely change messaging. We need to say different things. If you're not careful about it, you will end up with a European entity that stands for some things, and then you will end up with a US entity that stands for something completely different. And at some point, that's going to cause internal friction and trouble, because in which direction are you moving the product? So you got to be mindful of that. And when it comes to strategies and adaptation, if we can start ranking some things, I think today it's a no-brainer. You need to have, for your core markets, a UI that's localized. I think that's a no-brainer. Everybody speaks English today, but it doesn't matter. People are more comfortable in their own language. So I would say, for all the big markets, if you're selling here to the big 5 in Europe, like, if it's UK, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy, I mean, if you're serious about the market, I think you got to figure out to have some kind of a localized content. That's the first thing I'd like to recommend to people. Then the second thing I would recommend to people is more about understanding the buying patterns in those regions. English people buy slightly different from how Spanish people buy. They probably buy different from how Italian people buy, and so on. And it's more about understanding the buying behavior and building content and messaging to support the buying behavior. Because many people go in with the message like, well, we have a sales process. Here's the content and the message we plug in to support that sales process. But they don't think that not every country, not all individuals buy the same way. So it's about understanding that buying behavior. I think that's critical. And the companies that do this best are the ones that have the most success. Because at the end of the day, people buy from people. And you want to make sure you equip your people so they sell the Italian way, so they sell the Spanish way, so they sell the English way. Otherwise, you will have some friction in there.
Sorry to interrupt your listening, but do you want to grow your B2B SaaS in international markets? Because every country is different, and what users value in one market doesn't necessarily matter in another one. At Undertow, we help B2B SaaS companies like yours succeed in their international expansion. We create customized localization strategies that address the unique challenges of each market. In this way, you can effectively attract, engage, and convert customers worldwide. Visit undertowlanguages.com to find out more. And now back to the show. And connected to this, how do you think local partnerships can accelerate or maybe facilitate some of the things, like having a partnership with somebody that's already on the ground, already knows the market? Do you think that's something that works, or it depends on the kind of company and product?
I think it works in many cases, because it's hard, if you don't have any experience of a market, to understand also what potential forums there are where you can meet the customers. Depending on your product, you might have a product that needs implementation, that needs a little bit more hands-on. Of course, then you can work with SIs and so on that takes that, and they can maybe also do some of the selling for you with your support. You can work with resellers, of course, as well as a part to maybe plug into their offering. So I think in many cases, partner is a good way of getting into a new market. And what we also see in some cases is that I mean, there are these smaller partners as well that are, it's not the big, Accenture, Capgemini, whatever, because you will be a very small piece of their offering, even if it's flattering that they want to do something with you. So if you can find these smaller ones where what you offer actually become a business critical thing for you, that's better. And I mean, if we have also seen cases where this has been really, really good, and you end up buying that partner and they will become your presence in that area. So think about that when you're looking for partners. Both make sure that you become a vital part of what they do, and maybe also you can find that as an M&A strategy.
I 100% echo that. And one thing that I believe partners where they can help you initially is to help you with credibility and authority. When you come into a new market, nobody knows you. It doesn't matter how great your product is and so on. If they haven't heard of you before, you're still an unknown, which means you're still a risk to them. But if somebody else goes in and opens door to you, if they've already done business with this partner and they say, hey, you should work with Nicola, they're great at XYZ, then that kind of overcomes the initial barriers of trust. Because especially these days, people are really cautious and they want to spend their money wisely. They're not going to take a bet on something that's completely unknown and untested. So if you can use the partners to build that authority, I think that's a massive benefit, 100%.
And again, connected to this, when we're talking about sales and how we change the approach in different countries, if we stay, let's say, within Europe mostly, I know you have a lot of experience as well with the US, but like within Europe, have you seen like big differences and big shift in like the strategy, the sales strategies a company had to adopt when they move from one country to another? Let's say, for example, when they enter Germany compared to when they enter France.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And again, it depends on what you're selling. And if we're going to be, and I mean this in the best possible way, a little bit stereotypical here, there are some regions in Europe where in most organizations, they're rather flat organizational structures. The path between level 1, 2, and 3 is rather short and so on. And you can access the decision makers rather quickly, or people are, enabled to make decisions and calls and so on. And the Nordics is a typical country like this. To a certain extent, the Benelux is something like this as well. And in these regions, also the process is rather straightforward. But if you compare this, for example, to, at least in my opinion, we take Germany as a region. Germany has historically often have public tenders. There is some kind of a public tender. They invite a bunch of people. You have to fill out a bunch of fields and so on. The review process is much more structured. And you need to comply with that and follow those rules. And if you're selling enterprise solution, again, if we take Germany, my experience is that often there is a middleman or middlewoman. There's somebody in between you and the actual client buying that makes the initial gathering information, but also makes the short list of, hey, you guys should continue looking at these 3 people. So that puts a different challenge to you. It's not just about understanding who are the customers in this region. Thomas and I, we've lived this world. It's about understanding who are these middle companies that are then positioning the top 3 alternatives in each sales process, and what are their drivers, who are the people in these leagues. So you almost need to sell to them first before you can get access to the clients.
Yeah, I think the second week I worked at In River, I got a tender, a German company. It was 75 pages and 600 questions, and it was all in German.
Yeah.
So I had to put it through Google Translate, and then we had a German partner that helped us responding to it. So do you think we got the deal? No, we didn't. Years later.
Yeah, exactly. And to give you like a third example, again, this is in my experience, Thomas, you might be of a different experience, but what we see, what we've lived ourselves, UK as an example is probably the region in Europe where social relationships matter the most. There you have to build momentum, you have to build trust. The culture there is different. It almost feels like it's the same people that sell to each other all the time. So often there is a need to be involved, to get into and nestle into the community there. And that sometimes people misunderstand. They go like, well, I have the best product. Like, why are they buying that? But well, because that girl has sold 50 times to their friends and so on. So you got to get in that, and people underestimate it, which requires for you to do quite a big investment. It's like you need to go to these events, you need to show up, you need to shake hands and so on to get into the club before you can break that barrier.
Yeah, and I guess, as you said, like the sales cycle can stretch quite a lot compared to what you're used to, and taking that into account as well, and not expecting the same results that you have in your home market at the same time, the same speed that you usually have. That's definitely something to take into account when entering a market. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the customer support side of things, have you seen as well like something that maybe is underestimated when entering a new region, or something that should be kept in mind, in your opinion?
I certainly have some opinions. Thomas, I know you've worked with this as well a little bit, so go for it.
You said you have some opinions. So
Okay, let me take my opinions here. There, you have to remember here that whatever you're selling, it's not always the case that the person that signed the paper and that thinks this is a great idea, it's not always that she or he is the actual user of your platform. And we also have to remember that at times, the people that end up using the platform, whether we like it or not, sometimes they didn't have a choice in this. It was just presented to them. Now we're moving from this CRM to that CRM.
Or it might be field workers, some local device out when they are doing work somewhere.
Yeah. And while sometimes people feel like, well, I want to be talking to the economic buyer, the decision maker, and so on, and you might get in. But at some point, what matters is if the platform is not being used by the people that need to use it, you're going to churn. So you need to think about this from the beginning. Is like, one is, how do I, as fast as possible, onboard my new customers? And when I say onboard, you also have to identify, how do I train the trainers? How do I quickly build champions in here? And you have to have some programs for them. And I think, again, when it comes to, given the fact that we're in a localization pod here, we have to think to cater to these people in their own way, in their own language, in a manner that makes sense to them as much as possible. Some common mistakes we see here, again, is like Thomas said, it might be field workers that maybe don't feel comfortable with an English UI. You know what they're going to tell their bosses? The platform is shit, I'm not using it. There might be scenarios where they want to reach you. You know, it's much more easy to dial a local number than to dial an international number. People are a little bit hesitant, especially these days. People are afraid of the phone. And same thing with SLAs, like make them local. We've seen SLAs, and surely we've been guilty of this as well. Like, you know, oh, here are opening hours. We guarantee this uptime. By the way, on Swedish National Day, we're not going to be open. Like, Spanish people don't care about that. So like you got to have to adjust to have a program that suits them. And then I think one thing we would recommend to everyone, a lot of people go internationally and they say like, oh, look, Sarah, we're coming to Spain or Mango. Like, we have so many fashion brands. Look at this German cool fashion brand that uses us. We've learned the hard way that people don't necessarily care about what happens far away from them. It's much easier for them to understand who else in Spain is using you. So if you're going to do reference points, try to also have that as much localized. And one way, which what I was coming to, we always recommend is try to get your local customers next to each other. Try to get them to help each other. A Spanish person, don't quote me on this, but I would think initially in their journey would rather speak to another Spanish person than somebody in Germany. Once they get more comfortable and super users and so on, maybe then you give them your whole spectra here.
Yeah, and the last thing on customer support, I think, you know, in-app support and similar things that are quite easy to localize will grow the next coming years, and also voice-enabled and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I always recommend to have a look at, as you mentioned, the economic buyer and the end user, because depending as well on the vertical, there might be quite very different profiles as well and the way they think. And even like the regional position, you might have the economic buyer in just a couple of markets, but then they have the end user all over the place. And so they need the app, maybe the support, the help center articles, the language support. So I absolutely agree with what you said. It's a great thing to keep in mind when going international. And is there any other like common pitfalls that you see, like stories that you heard or that you've lived yourself when going pro? You mentioned already some, but is there any other, maybe one that you think is like either funny or something that thinking back, it's like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done that?
No, but I think it all comes down to knowing the market. And it might be so that you have a product market fit for your home market, but when you're in another market, you need to take a look at that. And so I think that would be the main thing. And as Daniel also pointed out before, what the sales process looks like. How does the buying product process look like in that market, and how you can adapt to that?
Yeah, I can just echo that. And one thing I want to emphasize here, if you decide to go international, consider this a warning of some kind. The companies that do fail, and I have been guilty of this once at least in my life and my career, is when you treat the geo expansion as an experiment. That means that when you say like, oh, you know what, we're going to go from outside of the Benelux now, and we're going to try France. We're going to try France and see what happens. And then you commit one poor salesperson in the region, you equip him or her with some material. Maybe you'll send them to one event, but there's not a big machinery around there. Like, product is not committed. Customer success is not committed. Marketing is not necessarily committed. So what happens here is that this person or the small team, they will be coming back and say like, hey guys, we're starting to see some patterns in France. We need this in the product. We need this in the collateral. I need to go to these shows. But if it's not a message that's widely communicated as strategically important, it's been communicated something, we're going to try it out. Marketing is going to say like, I don't have time for that now because strategically I need to focus on these things. Product are going to say like, I don't have time for that now. Like, this is not my KPI. It's not critical for me. So whatever you do, when you commit to a market, make sure to communicate internally that this applies to everyone, not to the two people that are actually in the region and trying to make something happen. It applies to everyone, and everybody needs to support this. And also be aware of it. I would say in 8 out of 10 times when you do something like this, especially if you're a smaller organization, these are your first steps, it's going to come at a price. It's going to slow you down a little bit on your domestic core market because you're going to shift focus and resources to get this new market going. It happens in 8 out of 10 times, and you got to be ready to muscle through that part. People, I think, underestimate that, and they feel like, oh, we tried this half an hour, we're losing some momentum here, we're going to stop.
Yeah, and also one addition to that, also, if you do that, if you make a commitment and you go into a market, make sure also that your founders are present, that they go there. And I mean, also to spread the culture and making sure that you don't get another version of your message or how you work there. So be present also with your culture bearers in those regions.
That's a great point to close on. And it's a great advice. I agree, like avoiding to be diluted your brand as well when you go into a new market. It's okay to adapt the messaging to make sure that you address the pain points in that market, but you definitely need to make sure that it's still the same brand, and you don't end up again like with several smaller brands all around the world. On the note, before we closing, is there any best way for people to reach out and learn more about the SaaSiest community, or any specific channel that you would recommend if somebody wants to reach out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we basically live on LinkedIn. So Thomas Sjöberg or Daniel Nackovski on LinkedIn. I think I have probably a little bit more unique name than Thomas. I don't think there's so many Daniel Nackovskis on LinkedIn.
More famous people named Thomas Sjöberg.
But the easiest way is probably to go to SaaSiest.com, and you'll find the details of how you can reach out to us. And we respond to each and every phone call, each and every email, each and every DM as fast as we possibly can. And one of us will always come back.
We'll put that in the show notes as well, so people can easily find it. But thank you so much again for joining us today on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us today. The Multilingual Content Podcast is powered by Undertow. We help B2B SaaS companies grow in any language. Get in touch if you want to know more. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episode. If you want to support us, remember to give 5 stars to the podcast. See you next time.